We're now going to have some talks by two discussants, Kate Gordon and Deborah Wang, and the format we've chosen here is that each discussant can focus her talk on any of the comments that are made by the three presenters up to now. So first let me introduce Kate Gordon.
This is cumulative
Kate is the Vice President and Director of Next Generation's Energy and Climate Program. She has a focus on transitions to renewable economy. She also looks at the important interactions and connections between clean energy and economic development, and she's a regular contributor as an energy expert to the Wall Street Journal. And also just taking the stage right now is Deborah Wang. Deborah is director of the California Energy Program for the Natural Resource Defense Council. And in that capacity, she promotes energy efficiency, renewable energy, and other solutions to various environmental problems, especially climate change problems. And I must say that Deborah has also been very much involved and can take some of the credit, I would say credit rather than blame, for California's AB 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act. So now that our original presenters and discussants are here, we're going to have some comments by the discussants, and then that will be followed by some general discussion. I'm going to moderate a discussion among all five of us.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Those were amazing presentations. Thank you so much. And I guess we have about 5 minutes to dump all our reactions on them, and then we'll have a conversation. So to do that in 5 minutes. My work in general has been very U.S. focused and very at the intersection of politics and policy. And so I will kind of talk from that perspective a little bit. The first thing that really struck me with these presentations is that I was very happy to see behavioral change talked about at the same time as policy and technology. We often talk about policy as if it's and technology as if either one of them can be the sort of silver bullet to this whole problem, that if we just got the right economy-wide cap and trade policy, everything would be resolved in the United States. If we just got the right technology drivers and the right R&D investment, everything would be solved. And I think it's a real mistake to kind of take that silver bullet approach. If we take a step back, and what I've done in general is looked at this not as much from a sort of technology lens as an economic development lens. If we take a step back and think about integrating all kinds of different policies, but also education and behavioral change, that's really where we're going to have to go to solve this massive, enormous problem that we're facing. So sort of number one thing is there's no silver bullet. I think Mark might have said this, that we kind of know what the policies are and we're just having a hard time getting them passed politically. I think that's right. But we also know what the policies are, but we need to be integrating those policies with education and behavioral change goals. So that no silver bullet was my first big reaction. My second big reaction is, though, that behavioral change, I think, isn't divorced from policy. So, to give a California example, we're doing a lot of work in California right this second on implementing a proposition that just passed in November called Proposition 39 that we hope will put a bunch of money into California K through 12 schools for energy efficiency. Energy efficiency, as everyone in the room probably knows, has a major behavioral component. You can basically get your savings or not, depending on whether you maintain the systems you put in place and have the behavioral component. In this context, there is a policy solution. There's a pure education solution, but there's also a way that you could, for instance, put some of the money in the policy toward training custodians so that there's a behavior change education built into the policy framework. So I do think that we here in the United States are very reluctant to talk about behavioral change, but that to the extent that we can incorporate those education and training goals, and not just workforce training, but long-term behavioral change training into policies here, it's incredibly valuable, and I really appreciate Jevashri talking about the importance of those policies. And then the final thing that I would say, and I think we'll get into it a little bit later in the discussions, is, in large part, in this country, but also increasingly in other countries. I mean, every time there's a recession, it seems, we go from having a discussion about how to deal with the science and how to move forward on climate change to a very political environment where it's very hard to do anything. So in this country and many other countries, this is honestly a political issue more than anything else. Dealing with climate change in the US has become political and partisan. And in fact, we have the public sentiment in favor of doing something. We have a number of pretty high-level actors in this country who want to do something, but it's become a purely political issue. So I guess I would just end up here by saying, as we're thinking about that sort of mishmash of policies, technologies, infrastructure, behavioral change that are going to have to move us forward on climate change, we also need to think about actually making it have a political cost to not do anything. And that's an incredibly difficult thing to do, but something that if we don't do, it's going to continually be impossible to move forward at a national level here. So those are my overarching comments. I will stop and turn it over to Deborah.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'm gonna sit. Well, first of all, thank you to all of the presenters and all of the authors of the GEA. You've put together a really remarkable work product here, and it's been a really interesting day and a half. I wanted to reflect on the vision that's really laid out in the GEA. I think you all have made a very persuasive case that as a global society, we can address our energy and our economic, our health challenges. But it begs the question, if we know how to do this, why aren't we already on the right path, obviously? And I think that there's a very long list of root causes of why we're not on the right path, and I wanted to just spend a few minutes on one that I saw as a theme emerging from these 3 chapters. And that is that our energy systems as a whole really haven't been focused on supplying the right product, so to speak. So what do I mean by that? Well, we're focused on supplying energy at low prices. That sounds pretty good normally. What's wrong with that? Well, we've heard a number of times that consumers don't actually care about energy in its own right. Consumers care about energy services. Consumers don't care about the price of a unit of energy. They don't even know what that unit of energy is. They care about the cost of the energy services, light or warm homes, etc. And similarly, in the transportation sector, consumers don't care about mobility, simply being able to move around. We care about accessibility, being able to get to the places that we want to reach conveniently, whether it's work or the grocery store or school. And now this can often sound like a semantic debate, energy versus energy services or mobility versus accessibility, but I would argue that it's actually a very fundamental cause of why we're not on the right path, because we've set our sights on the wrong objective. And I come from an engineering background, so I tend to think of it as if you're optimizing for the wrong variable, of course you're going to get the wrong answer in your system. And so I think we really need to think about refocusing our entire system on the objective that society actually cares about. Yesterday, Arun Majumdar noted that our electric grid is stuck back in the days of Edison and Tesla, and I very much agree. But it's not just the grid itself, it's not just the technology, it's also our policies, our regulatory frameworks, and our business models. They're all stuck in the days of Thomas Edison. And I think that is in large part why we see this enormous gap between what can be accomplished on energy efficiency, as a number of people talked about, and what's actually happened, because we have structured our regulatory frameworks and our business models such that the boundaries put all demand-side options off the table. They're outside of the blinders, essentially, that we have on our system. And so we need to refocus the direction that we're looking in order to make all of those great solutions that you all have talked about part of the system that we're driving towards. I think a great example there is the utility sector. We haven't talked that much about utilities in the last day and a half, but they're very central players in this vision that the GEA has laid out. If you think in the United States, utilities account for more than half of our carbon dioxide emissions, a similarly large fraction globally. But the thing that I think should give us all a moment of pause is to think about the fact that utilities are public entities. They're either publicly owned or they're publicly regulated around the world. So everything that utilities are doing is driven by public governing bodies. So this is a clear mismatch here. If the public governing bodies are driving the utilities in a path that is not leading to all of the benefits that have been outlined, what's wrong? And again, I think it's because all of our regulatory approaches and business models are stuck in the mode where they began 100 years ago when the focus was simply on infrastructure expansion. We're getting more and more steel in the ground was a great thing, and so all of our incentives are aligned to continue to put more and more steel in the ground without a focus on what consumers actually care about, which is the end services that they're getting from the energy system. So I think one of the fundamental challenges that we face is the need to really reinvent the utility business model, reinvent the regulations that are shaping those utility business models. And I wanted to just emphasize one of the things that Anand talked about this morning. We've talked a lot about the need for research and development and innovation in energy technologies. And that's critically important, I absolutely agree. But we also really need innovation around regulatory approaches, innovation around business models. And so I hope that we'll all take on the collective challenge of figuring out, given the vision that the GEA has laid out for some of these scenarios that can provide all of these co-benefits, how can we create the sustainable businesses that will lead us in that direction? How can we create the regulatory frameworks that will encourage them so that we aim our sights in the right direction instead of continuing down this path that we're on simply because of the legacy of the system? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, I think we have a lot of stimulating ideas here, and I want to sort of probe further with some questions to all of you. And with any of these questions, I invite any of you to answer. But as I listened to Joyashree's presentation, as well as the recent comments by Kate, I see a articulation of three main avenues for policy to deal with improving energy efficiency and making energy cleaner. One is to try to encourage a change in social norms, to change preferences and attitudes. A second is to try to, whatever the attitudes or preferences might be, to provide incentives, for example, price incentives or subsidies to change behavior, even if the attitudes haven't changed so much. Third, and Kate mentioned this just briefly, public investment in infrastructure. So I think those are all promising directions. What strikes me is that we can have a lot of ideas about what we need to do, but it's not so clear whether what we're able to do. That is to say, where are the political roadblocks, or put the other way, where are the political windows of opportunity? And I was struck by Mark's comments toward the end, despite my having cut him off too early from his time, about the successes in Canada. So I'd like to invite any of you to say, where are the opportunities here? Where can we overcome the political obstacles? To go beyond articulating what we would like to do and actually see what we can do. Anybody? Yeah, Joyashree.
I would start with the last point which I mentioned in the last slide, and last but one slide, which really shows that, yeah, can you hear me?
I think so.
Yeah. Yeah, so what I wanted to say is that basically all the business model, all the political will, or all the consumers are behaving within a particular socio-economic setup, which says you just go on consuming more. If you are polluting more, which means that you are producing more. And so that's good for your economy, right? So you are using more coal, you are using more car, and you are using more food and wasting more food, but that waste doesn't show up in your national income accounting, and which is the accounting framework which makes your budgetary allocation by the political parties for all the activities, so sectoral flow of income and the expenditure. So basically, unless you change your structure and the framework and the goals of the economy, so all economies are now thinking how to produce more and how to produce more and how to increase income and consumption, right? So basically, you are not allowing them a scope for choosing a better alternative. Say corporates, they are promoting eating more meat. You go to the hotels, that hotel we go where they serve bigger piece of steak rather than a smaller one. So whether we can eat it or not doesn't matter, but we just go there because that's how that is being promoted. So that's what I'm just saying is that, so it's not the well-being, not the constituent of the well-being, the health, whether you are having a healthy life or not. If you are spending more for your heart diseases, then your GNP goes up, your income goes up. So I think it's a need for changing the whole framework, what really matters. And there really, the economists, social scientists have a very important role to play. And for a very long time, these are in discussion, but they really need to be implemented now.
Thank you. Mark?
If I could just add something. I, all my life, have wanted to see significant behavioral change, and I've tried to live my life that way as well. But if I'm to think, of Larry's question and what I was trying to get at in my talk, I really want to be careful not to increase the degree of difficulty of something that's already really difficult. So I want to be careful about the extent to which I wrap a whole bunch of other objectives into something like greenhouse gas reduction, for example. And so that, now it's going to be that much more difficult. And I'll maybe take off on something that Devra said. You talked about mobility and said, really, it should be accessibility. And I'm thinking, cars? So I do a lot of discrete choice surveys, my research team does, on humans and mobility, and we follow the literature. And when I think of a car, I think of that what people see there, different people, status, pleasure, time flexibility, private space, comfort, freedom, some various kinds of self-image, maybe sexual insecurity compensation, I don't know. That shows up too, actually. And so when Arnold Schwarzenegger was pushing in California for strong climate policies and the whole mixture of regulations and moving towards cap and trade, I saw scenes where he went in, met with other people who had Hummers like he did, and he showed them not how to get rid of a Hummer for the accessibility that you want, but how he converted one of his Hummers, I think, to biofuel, and another one to hydrogen, and I don't know how many Hummers he had, but
9 or something.
And so, yes, let's change behavior, but let's be careful. Like, ask yourself, how much did we change behavior to get acid emissions down? So that's the kind of run through I do with people, and maybe I've provoked something.
No, I think that's really you're raising a question that I think plagues all of us who work on climate change policy, which is that the solutions have to be really big in order to work. Most of the really big solutions are big policy solutions that are completely inaccessible to most people. So you have this problem. I think about the US, we had inconvenient truth leading to an economy-wide cap and trade debate. That was sort of the level of discussion. Inconvenient truth presents a problem that's almost impossible to wrap your head around as an individual. And then the economy-wide cap and trade debate was a policy solution that was almost impossible to wrap your head around as an individual. So everything gets taken down to a level of what can I do individually? I think we, as climate change people, and I come actually from more of an economic background, but I do think that one of the biggest mistakes we make is to tell people that their individual actions aren't good enough. That, whatever we do, you've all heard this, whatever, even if we start today doing everything we need to do, we're still screwed because the climate is going to hell. I mean, this is what we all say all the time or hear all the time. But there has to be something that brings this, for the political reasons Larry talked about, there has to be something that brings this to the personal level. So I think it's, Mark's making a really good point. It can't be a kind of preachy personal level. You have to bring things to a personal level that's actually personal, but we also have to acknowledge that that's not going to solve the problem. It may be part of a long-term political kind of and an educational process, but it's not going to solve the problem. And I think it's really, really difficult for those of us who do policy in this area to wrap our heads around that, because we all know that the problem is bigger than that and needs bigger solutions. But we also know that essentially the entire discussion at this point is happening among maybe 2% of the population.
Thank you. I want to ask another question that's policy related. And I think Arnold, I hope I can entice you to at least offer some commentary on this. You offered some fascinating information about different ways that we could get engaged in trying to promote technology. And so two related questions. One is you mentioned these different stages of technological development, starting with basic research, and then you move toward demonstration, then diffusion, market, and then commercialization. Where do you think along that chain we would best put our efforts? There is a line of thought that suggests that public policy and incentives to innovate are most productive at the basic research level, and that we should leave out the later stages. But then some of what you suggested in your slides might indicate otherwise. I'd be interested in your thoughts along those lines, and in thoughts by any other panelists as well.
Well, Larry, I think it is useful to make a distinction between money and effort. So clearly, public sector money, which is extremely limited, needs to focus on where the bang for the buck is the largest, sure, which is in the early phases where innovation efforts are cheap. R&D is very cheap in comparison to market formation or diffusion investments. I mean, that's why we have done this in innovations.
Not just cheap, but more productive.
Well, productive. There's high risk, so a lot of innovations fail. 95% of innovation efforts fail. But, R&D globally requires $50 billion, market formation about $150 billion, and diffusion investments are $1.5 trillion. So just to give you the relative orders of magnitude. So clearly, if the public sector wants to invoke radical change in the diffusion phase of the technology, in the actual market deployment of a technology, public sector doesn't have the money. So the money needs to be focused there where public sector money can leverage private sector money significantly, and this is in the earlier stages. But money is one thing and effort is another. So at the risk of provoking a little bit and in the interest of a discourse, I would say don't spend any money if you're not prepared to do the effort to put in regulation in place to provide the appropriate market incentives for the deployment of the new technology. So sorry, Sally, to use CCS as an example, don't spend any public sector money on CCS if you're unprepared to impose a carbon price. Because without the carbon price, this add-on technology will never have a market. Other technologies, PV panels and so on, are a little bit different, but CCS is really a special breed. It has only a business model with a carbon price. So if you're not prepared for the effort, policy introducing a carbon price, don't even bother to spend in public sector R&D money. And I think the usual political discourse, I'm cognizant of the realities obviously, is of course different. You basically want to take a shower, but not to get wet. So you want to pretend we do something on climate change. The Bush administration, if you allow me this political characterization here, was a classical example. So you don't want to do anything on climate change, so you say, oh yeah, we'll spend $5 billion on, I don't know, the hypercar or something like that. So R&D is often misused as a kind of symbolic gesture in order not to do the policy effort. But this is, from our perspective, an absolute ineffective innovation policy intervention.
I'm going to provoke you even further. I think you said two things. One is what most economists would agree. You should think of the bang for the buck and allocate funds where you can get at the margin the highest bang for the buck. The second thing you said was that the bang for the buck depends a lot on whether you have complementary policies in place that, for example, allow CCS to flourish, that is, have a carbon tax in place. But there's a question also about the breadth. That is to say, where does the R&D go in terms of what industries or what parts of the economy? We've been talking about energy here,
But there's this line of thought that says we shouldn't be picking winners. We shouldn't be deciding on particular technologies. If we're going to have R&D subsidies, they should be broad-based and not only cover all the energy sector, but cover the economy as a whole. And the critics would point to Solyndra or would point to certain failures and suggest we shouldn't be doing that. I see by Kate's reaction that she's not entirely in sympathy with that criticism. So what do you all think of this issue? Where should we be focusing, let's say in the technology context, our subsidies or our R&D promotion policies? Is there a problem with picking winners?
Yes, go ahead. Oh, I was just shaking my head at Solyndra because there are so many things that happened in that case that were out of the control, that weren't about picking winners, that were out of the control of many of us. The only other thing I'd say is that I think a lot of people look at the Recovery Act as an example of what you were talking about, where there was a lot of R&D investment without the market forcing policy. But I just want to remind everybody the point of that was it was supposed to go hand in hand with an economy-wide cap and trade program. And unfortunately, the cap and trade part didn't pass, and the Recovery Act did. But it ended up providing a great example of what you're talking about, which is a lot of training for jobs that didn't end up existing and a lot of R&D investment for technologies that didn't end up being cost competitive. So, although it had a lot of good things too. But it's a great example, it just underscores what you're saying.
Yes, Mark.
Well, so first of all, I really agree with what Arnold said. And that's, I hope that's the message you got from my talk about the need for the compulsory policies. And so I am much more thinking about not the R&D side, but the adoption. But then I did make some quick comment there about that if political acceptability meant that you were politicians are going for regulations because they're sort of a little more under the radar, at least various kinds of regulations. And I will note that the modeling I've done with other people for California shows that you would have achieved 90% of what your target was to 2020 without ever putting on the cap and trade. Like that it's sort of picking up the remainder right now. It's all those regulations you did. And so for me, what I said was, as an economist, my goal with regulations is to try to see if we can make them a little closer to what a price instrument would be. And I'll give you two examples. One is I take pride that the policy for electricity in British Columbia is a clean electricity standard rather than a renewable portfolio standard. So it said in there, you could use natural gas and coal, but you had to have carbon capture and storage. So it didn't say we're only going with renewables, right? It said, so we are, we're trying not to pick winners.
Give partial credit to natural gas, for example?
What do you mean partial credit?
Well, when you say the object is clean energy rather than renewables per se,
yeah,
how would you structure the standard?
Well, we structured it so that, we defined a zero emission technology in a way that you could do natural gas with carbon capture and storage, so there would be a little bit of emissions, and likewise coal with carbon capture and storage. But the idea was to let the market kind of sort that out, especially as it needed less intermittent energy at some point. And likewise, the California Vehicle Emission Standard. Now, I know there are different positions about that, and I think you and I argued about that once. I liked elements of that because it had these categories: zero emission, ultra low emission. I think now it has super ultra low emission, low emission, and so it was saying, get out there, industry, and you got to try to get into each of these slots. And then as a regulator going forward, industry was able to come back to them and say, you know what, I don't think we can make it on the zero emission right now. But what if we do more with the low emission and still get the same environmental outcome you want? So there was that kind of a regulation that's kind of driving technological change, creating a niche market for these technologies, but then also helping out along the way.
Your comment, Mark, is sort of consistent with the theme I heard from Joyashree about how we have to think of things from a systems perspective, and also what I heard earlier about we have to think about what are our ultimate objectives. But I still didn't quite get an answer to this question of picking winners. Arnold, what are you going to say about that?
Larry, we had in our writing team almost a 2-year debate on this. And, there are different viewpoints. And I think the compromise here is to say that, when we look from a historical perspective at technology-specific public sector intervention, that the success rate of this intervention by far is not worse, but also not better than the private sector. So the private sector is as bad as picking winner than the public sector. But of course we have a larger legitimation problem. We need to justify the public sector. So from a technology perspective, governments must not pick winners. They should pick performance characteristics. But what governments legitimately can do and should do is to pick priorities, reflecting social needs, externalities, or political priorities, which is legitimate. And so therefore, where you allocate the funds is a legitimate political decision-making process, hopefully informed by science and by transparency. And this is, I think, that's why I have presented this rather abstract analytical concept, because I think we are now ready to provide this kind of information and to say, okay, now we move the public discourse of how much money we spend on, I don't know, transportation, hypercars versus building codes or things like that. Or public policy in some cases legitimately can pick a priority area because it represents a unique window of opportunity.
In terms of characteristics?
Even sometimes of a technology. For instance, I give you one example from one of the case study, super efficient windows. So the Swedish government put out a tender to firms and say, if you supply us with a super efficient window, 1 watt, okay, so really super efficient window, we will buy a minimum guaranteed amount of 300,000 windows per year for the public housing projects in Sweden. So we have a captive market. This is social housing, so it's a public objective to lower the energy costs of the poor residents in public housing, and it's all public procurement. You're not saying by which technology and which firm, you make out a competition, and the competing firm actually put a tender up with a design, got the contract, and all of a sudden you had a new design and a new entrepreneurial business model actually operating, and this firm is now extremely successful and exports all over Europe. So in this particular case, you're very specific, but you're legitimately specific in terms of public policy intervention because you perceive a unique opportunity in creating, a new product, a new business model, and a new export commodity for a small open economy like in the case of Sweden.
Yes, Deborah.
I agree, and I also want to highlight the important interrelationship between the performance standards and regulations spurring innovation and research and development in the private sector to leverage the public sector investments, because we see that there's a tremendous amount of private sector innovation that goes into meeting performance standards. Take the federal light bulb standards, for example. It's gotten a lot of attention and press in the United States. And as much research and development that went into the early days of developing better lighting technologies from the public sector, that simple performance-based standard that says light bulbs have to emit the same amount of light but use less energy has spurred an order of magnitude more private sector research and development and innovation than you could get from the public effort. So these really do need to be complementary, and I think that as Kate said, policymakers are so often searching for that one silver bullet, just give me the one answer, and it really does a disservice in the policymaking process to try to trade off any of these elements against each other, because you won't succeed unless you get the whole package, and we need to be communicating that effectively.
But just really quickly on that, I completely agree about performance standards, but there are situations where there are high-risk investments that we need to make to move a sector forward. I mean, the loan guarantee program tried to do that. It had a very low default rate overall, so it did quite well, actually. But, we've done this historically forever. I mean, the reason we don't worry about it that much in the U.S. is that we mostly do it through the Department of Defense, which its entire purpose is to pick winners. But it does it within a context of national security, so we don't ask a lot of questions about it. That's where solar panels came out of. That's where a number of other energy microgrids are getting advanced in the DoD. We do pick winners all the time. So it's sort of a false discussion. I mean, we're talking about a major social purpose or a national security purpose here, and we should just accept that this is something we do. Okay. And doing it through performance standards may be the most efficient way to do it, but it is something we do and we have always done.
I want to ask one more question before we then move to questions from the audience. And one theme or one issue in Mark's talk was he emphasized that there is a need for compulsory policies. They can take many forms through conventional regulation, performance standards, pricing policies, cap and trade, carbon taxes. So I want to be specific here. In the EU ETS, the European Union's emissions trading scheme, as you all know, that experiment has led to very low prices recently, and many critics have argued that this is an indication that this emissions market approach was a failure, and others would disagree. What can we learn from what happened in Europe under the European Union's emissions trading scheme? Does it mean that we should stick with cap and trade as in California, but do something different? Should we stick with the approach in Europe, or should we move away from cap and trade toward carbon tax, performance standards, whatever? What's the lesson here?
Deborah.
Yeah, Mark?
Okay, well, I'll start. So if you do cap and trade, then you're focusing on the emission level. I mean, I'm setting aside if there are offsets in there and some other, what I will call loopholes, but if you're putting a cap on something, you're saying, I don't care as much about the price, I'm trying to cap something. And so if your society stays within that cap, whether because of economic recession or whatever, it achieves its environmental objective, I don't see why you'd then be complaining if the price went really low. And in fact, the price going really low sort of is helping your economy in a time of recession. It's basically saying, look, we made the emissions level, and so now the price is low. Now, if you're looking at it, though, from a longer-term perspective where you're saying, I'm putting in this cap and trade because I really want to get to a different level of emissions at the end of the day, and I'm hoping for long-term investment and some stability for an investment, then really what you're saying is, actually, I want to give two signals out there. I want to give a cap signal, and I want to give some kind of price security signal for people who are investing in innovation, people who are investing in capital already as part of on the demand side. Then you have the option of designing a cap and trade in ways that it does both of those things. You put a price floor in there and work on mechanisms like that. And I may have read something by you on this, but I know Paul Joskow is, other people have written on this. And so that's my response. So I was just in Europe recently, and there was much hand-wringing about that low price. And I at least tried to point out the economist's perspective, which is, hey, you're just having a recession right now, so that price is going down, and that's how you designed the thing. So, if you're not happy with that, do it differently.
Yes, Deborah?
Well, I think cap and trade is an interesting policy tool because low prices can either be a sign of success or failure. And it's very hard to figure out which one to the lay public, because it can be a success if you've found much cheaper ways to meet your emission reduction objectives. That's great. Or it can be a failure if you design the policy wrong and you set the cap too high. I think that, Europe clearly led the way on this policy, but there's also been a lot of lessons that other jurisdictions, including California, have learned from their experience. And California in particular has made a number of changes in our cap and trade program to learn from some of their lessons, including getting a solid reporting system in place in advance of the start of the program, setting the cap tightly, and ensuring, hopefully, as the program continues to roll out, that there's no windfall profits associated with the distribution of the value of the emission permits. So I think we've all learned a lot of very valuable lessons from the EU. And to your point about cap and trade versus a carbon tax, I want to go back to the no silver bullet point. And Mark just raised that in California, the cap and trade program is a small part of California's efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's a very important part, but it's less than 20% of the emission reductions that we're expecting. And there really, again, is no silver bullet. In order to get an economy-wide emission reduction, we can't just rely on one policy tool. We need to go after all of the different regulations and performance standards in the utility sector, in the transportation sector, and these economy-wide approaches to back that up. And I really appreciated one of the comments, Mark, you made in your presentation, that when it comes to policy making, since we're often in the trenches trying to get the policymakers to move policies forward, it's not particularly helpful to debate the theoretical merits of one approach versus another, because at the end of the day, there's other considerations that policymakers are really caring about. And so what's more important is getting the motivation to do something on climate, and then figuring out what will work within the political system and the constraints that exist to move the ball forward, rather than pitting the same side against each other, trying to argue about one system being much more theoretically appealing than another system. So the very practical approach that you outlined is something that rang very true to me, having gone through some of these battles.
We'd like to invite folks in the audience now who have questions. Except for John Wyant, I don't think after yesterday's introduction of Naki, we should allow him to say anything. Well, we'll make an exception. Go ahead, John.
Poor John.
You may regret this. I again want to speak on behalf of all the incredible young people I've been fortunate enough to deal with at all levels at Stanford, all disciplines. First of all, Arnoff, you'll see on the tape somebody flipping you a bird when you said it's okay at Stanford to be erudite, intellectual, and let society go to hell in a handbasket. That may be true at Yale, but I don't think it's true here. With that, I'll talk to you later. Second of all, I think these young people would find this particular panel extremely inspirational, each and every one of you, particularly Deborah and Kate, I would say. But I think they would say that's not good enough. For two reasons. I think they're tired of waiting for political will to emerge. They're tired of waiting for public policy to save us all. They're ready to take action. These are not the protesters. These are the people in business, government, law, etc. So I want to end this with kind of a personal observation based on a good friend of mine, a guy you probably all know. He's done energy efficiency, so I'm going to limit it to energy efficiency. Half in here, half in the US, half in Australia. So his perception is, in Australia, you can go straight to the consumers, maybe through surrogates, but straight, no regulators, no whatever, no political process. Here you got to go through the utilities. So now you can probably guess what I'm going to say. Do we really believe either of the utilities, and you guys are the experts on this, either the utilities or the regulators actually represent the interest of the consumers or the public at this point? I would say that situation is slightly better than average in California, but in most of the remaining 49 states, it's totally awful. Look at the Southeast, we all know that. So what are you gonna do? I think what's going to happen is we're going to see innovative new business models using social media and a whole bunch of stuff us old guys don't actually know anything about. And they're going to go directly, I was going to say to the people, but that sounds too airy-fairy. They're going to go directly to the consumers very rapidly. So I think over the next 10 years or so, you're going to see that part of the revolution. I think that fits in the framework that's been laid out by the GEA. But those are just the initial conditions for these guys. I feel very strongly, and I think you guys, so far, are my favorites to help them along, because I've gone as far as, I've told them they need to learn Krav Maga to be successful, and now they've learned it. And I'm at the end of my ability to help them. I think all you guys could help them along. So if you see them, I have a few NDAs operating here, but I could give you a few names if you're interested. Thanks.
Any responses?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think it's obviously great to go straight to the consumer, and that's an important part of the picture. But if you look at where the investment flows are going in the country, they really are flowing through the utilities. Right, it doesn't have to be that way, that's true, but what we're, at the end of the day, talking about is redirecting societal investments away from dirty power plants and into cleaner things like energy efficiency. And you can either do that the hard way, fighting David versus Goliath against the huge entities that have massive profit motives to go out and keep building power plants, or you can do it the easier way by trying to redirect those investments. So I agree with you that the regulatory structures today generally are not representing the best interests of consumers. That was one of my main points, that they're stuck in a 100-year-old framework that was simply focused on infrastructure expansion, not on what consumers actually care about. But at the same time, they are built on the foundations of a democratic public process. And there are opportunities for your students and the rest of us to participate in that public process to reshape our governing institutions. And I think that has to be an important part of this conversation and the way forward.
I know that we have short for time, but super quick. I have a lot of optimism when it comes to utilities, actually. I think if we're going to see disruption, we'll see disruption in the utilities, and we'll see it in the car companies, thinking about the transportation side. The car companies, when they dealt with the emission standards, they were dealing with Tesla coming up, with foreign auto companies, with a lot of disruptive technology from all over the place, and they had to respond to that because their backs were against the wall. I do think that companies like Mosaic, other kinds of interesting service companies on the solar and distributed generation side are making the utilities have to re-examine their business model, and they are up against a wall. I'll tell you who's not up against a wall and who's not interested in change is the oil companies. I don't see them as being change agents in this conversation in the same way that the utilities are, but I do have optimism when it comes to utilities.
But you were talking about efficiency. I mean, the utilities have never been able to stop someone from going downstream of your meter, knocking on your door, and doing efficiency. So I don't see that there was this barrier there. I mean, that's why I've kind of come around to the world where I believe in regulatory solutions to efficiency.
I think this is an issue that we can discuss for a long time, but in the interest of allowing for other questions, let it at least be recognized that there are differing points of view on this question, and that John has raised a rather provocative issue, and I'm not sure that everyone would agree. We have some questions coming up over here on this side of the room.
Siwam Sangi from the International Food Policy Research Institute. Moving a little bit away from OECD countries.
Can you speak a little louder, please?
I was thinking more about the non-OECD countries and the informal sector. I believe that was implicit in a lot of what was discussed, especially in the case of India, as being players. The success of irrigation technologies in India very much a part of the ICTs in Africa, another example where the informal sector gets in there. My question was sort of how do we include them in this space for experimentation? I'm thinking of Martin Fisher, who was here at Stanford, who actually developed technologies that the informal sector could go out and reproduce and make a profit from, some of them being cook stove technologies, some of them being treadle pumps and other things. So how do we get them, especially to help the diffusion in developing countries?
I would just share with you one of the experiences that we are running through in India. There are, say, in the mobility sector, we are doing that research in the mobility sector, and we are trying to see that at the grassroots level, what are the experiments which are happening, and whether they are sustainability consistent or not. And then we find that there are a lot of experiments which are happening at the grassroots level, but then they are not getting the right kind of, the political and the policy support, and they are actually emerging in the unsustainable path. And so basically they really need tremendous support to become sustainable in the long run. Otherwise, there will be huge, incumbent regime who is becoming, who will have a subversive nature, but then they will be staying within the system and leading to, in the negative sense, disruption. So it is very important that the informal sectors in the developing countries and whatever is happening there, how to make them sustainable is very, very important.
Yeah, okay. This is David Lobel from Stanford. I wanted to go back to the behavior change question. Just because I often so I work a lot in the food area and get asked about behavior change all the time and meat consumption, and I give a very similar answer to what Mark said, which is you don't take a difficult problem and make it more difficult. But I've started to wonder if that's really true for a couple of reasons. One is because I see how difficult policy change and political change is, and how limited technology change can be sometimes. But the other is because I think that's maybe too much of an American perspective on things, and that Americans are really loath to be told anything about changing their behavior. Although if you look at the New York City example, I mean, they are being told and they kick and scream a little bit, but it doesn't seem to have hurt too much politically. But I was wondering in particular about some of the other...
David, can I just ask for clarification here?
Yeah.
Are you talking about changes in attitudes and norms versus changing the way people act by way of regulation or incentives? Those are two different things.
Yeah, thanks. I'm mostly talking about the first that you said, the attitudes and norms. And I'm just wondering, how much evidence do we really have about the difficulty of changing, and in particular, how much do we understand about the differences in Asia versus OECD countries versus Africa and some Latin America? I'm just, is it really a genuinely ignorant on what is the evidence? I sort of know from personal experience it's hard to influence people's behavior, but maybe that's just I live in a very stubborn family with a lot of Americans.
I would say this way, that when the sociologist in our team suggested that we really need to go for the sufficiency rule, and there was a whole lot of debate around that. And then he came up with the argument that actually sufficiency, people think that there is a contradiction of thinking of a liberal society and then coming up with the sufficiency as a policy norm. But if you think it as sufficiency the way within the climate change and the energy regime, then you are really talking about creating the externality. So in a liberal society, also individual behavior, if that causes harm to someone else, can come within the externality and the the public policy norms. So from that point of view, you can think that the attitudinal changes can be brought up through the public policy changes also. So I would say that we really need to look into these changes. And the other thing, if we really look into how different societies are behaving differently or not, but very interestingly, the social norms are breaking through corporatization process in such a way that you are really going by the homogenization of the behavior. So instead of diversity, which is existing within a cultural system, which is a good thing, but that is getting broken down by telling that this is bad thing, so you really need to modernize, homogenize, and that's becoming the lifestyle issue and the social norm. So basically, giving space to the individual culture, diversity more, and then saying that, okay, these are nothing bad, these are good things, and you relate them to the good externality effect, and then you can pursue those norms. So I think, there is a time when we really need to think the way corporatization is happening and homogenization is happening, that really need to change.
Tom Stevenson, co-chair of the Hoover Institution's Energy Task Force here at Stanford. And my question is really for Mark. We've been intrigued with the prospect of a true revenue-neutral carbon tax as a way to level the playing field and reflect the true cost to the economy, to the environment of CO2 emissions. We've been underwhelmed by our observations of what's transpired with cap and trade. Seems to lend itself too much to manipulation and mischief. We've actually, Larry Goulder is a member of this task force and has participated in a lot of these conversations.
So
but we've spent some time.
I don't entirely agree with all of your perspective.
We will continue our conversations.
I'm not quite as concerned about cap and trade as you are.
but we've spent some time with the folks in the government in British Columbia. We've looked at what's gone on in Australia. My question to you is really what have you observed from your work in how this concept of a revenue-neutral carbon tax may spread elsewhere? We hope that it would have an opportunity here to avoid the politics of the right and the left, in the sense that if it isn't a tax, then the right's not going to get upset, and the left is going to be enthused about the price back of fully reflecting the costs to the environment and the economy of CO2 emissions.
So I'll be very brief. I've written a chapter for a book that came out last year, The Policy of Environmental Taxation, or the Handbook of Environmental Taxation, so I can get you a copy of that, and which I sort of broke down. I worked with some political scientists who were doing a bunch of public surveys at the same time, and that's what drove me to do the survey work that a PhD student is doing for me right now that I showed you a tiny bit of. Couple of things I will say. One is the politician who implemented that was both a policy wonk, so really interested in policy, and a right-of-center politician, and a risk taker. So I had to ask myself, what's the probability of finding all three of those things somewhere around in North America? And I started to understand why nobody's copied what he did. And at the same time, if you can get a right-of-center politician to do this, when he came out with the carbon tax, we had the whole business community on side, because they believed that some other policy like cap and trade or a bunch of regulations would come in. And so it was fantastic to see how this rolled out in a budget where they couldn't give away that the tax was coming, but they'd given enough behind-the-scenes negotiations, discussions, so that the word was out. And in fact, the business community thought that it wouldn't be a revenue-neutral carbon tax, so they were elated. So expectations management is good. Like, they thought, oh, some of this money is going to go for whatever wish list. And so I learned a lot about how you roll out something like that. The last point I want to make, though, is that in that survey that I've got my PhD student Katya Petropavlova working on, is I wanted to show you that the opposition to the carbon tax might have been 45%, and there's still support of around 50% in British Columbia, now that it's in place. Not really to increase it, but to get it stay at the 30. That 40% opposition can be amazingly vocal, powerful, distorting, and that's what we really saw in an election where the Social Democratic opposition promised they would get rid of the carbon tax, but fortunately the recession of 2008-2009 came along and people voted right of center and hung on to the carbon tax by default. So very difficult the way people play politics with something like that, and everybody assumed, polls showed, that they were worse off by the carbon tax, whereas our own macroeconomic modeling showed only a few rich people were worse off with the carbon tax who happened to have a second house and travel a lot. Everybody else benefited. But when you surveyed people, if they were suburban commuters, if they lived in the north, if they were rural, they just all believed that they were worse off under that carbon tax.
Well, we're out of time. I know that a lot of us still have questions we'd love to ask, but please join me in thanking this panel for a stimulating discussion.